Okay, this is the final installment, and in it we're going to apply the models that we just went over to evaluate an unrelated but very brief argument with the hope that in doing so, you'll better understand the process of analysis. And then we'll glance back at the prompt and talk about how to approach the structure of this paper, specifically the introductory paragraph, which is very often the most important component of one's work. Now, we're going to read this small argument that's only about 6 paragraphs long. And as I read, I'll have on my mind the list of rhetorical strategies featured in the glossary. By the way, you should probably have a copy next to you while you read these texts, and you should be looking for strategies, the rhetorical strategies that you can see being employed by the authors in their effort to move their intended audience. This is what we mean by persuasive techniques in the prompt. To begin, remember, we first need to consider context. Why? Because an argument does not arise absent context. When we communicate, it's always in a certain place, in a certain time, and there's always opportunities and constraints embedded in these occasions. We want to identify those because if we're any good, and if the author's any good, they'll have considered these contextual factors, and mindful of them, they'll work strategically to tailor their claims to meet the needs of the audience. All right, so in this example, we're going to read this brief article, Weight Loss Industry Masks Its Economic Interests with Bogus Health Concerns. Now, on the right of the document, I've included my notes, and every time I read something rhetorically, what I do, by the way, is I identify claims that are being made in each paragraph or each section, and then I note strategies that are being used, and that way I have a sense for not only what the author's trying to say, but how and why they're trying to say that. I recommend doing the same. Now remember, before we can even begin reading, we need to understand what the context is. So let's go down the list. Who's the audience? The audience in this case is easy, readers of the Union Tribune. Who reads the Union Tribune? Overwhelmingly, it's going to be Southern California residents, particularly San Diegans. And because of the genre, we're actually going to consider it a general audience. And that's because it's so widely distributed. And you have all walks of life who read it, from rich and poor, Black, white, Latino, liberal, conservative, gay, straight. You name the category and somebody in the intended audience will fit into it. So we just consider this a general audience. The rhetor or the author, who is this? Well, this is Professor Rothblum, and she's an SDSU professor of women's studies. What do we want to know about her? We want to know if she's qualified to make an argument. At this point, we're not really sure. That will depend on whether or not That depends on the nature and the scope of her argument and whether she speaks in areas that are aligned with her expertise. Likely she's going to be pro-citizen and anti-business, or at least anti-big business. Now, we don't know this for a fact because we haven't read it yet. However, these would be tentative assumptions I'd make about her beliefs. Her purpose, we still don't really know this as well, but judging by the title, it seems that she might be aiming to persuade. It sounds like she might want people to stop buying weight loss products. And then finally, the exigency. What makes this argument relevant? I would say 2 things at least. The growing obesity problem. It continues to plague the West. And maybe some research, as indicated by her title. Maybe new research has shed a light on the state of affairs. Or maybe it's all the billions of dollars being made by the industry. And to keep the video length short, I'm going to recommend pausing it at this point, just quickly reading that paragraph, and then taking note of strategies used and what you think the claim is, and then resume this video. So go ahead and do that now. Now, here's my assessment of it. She claims that society's preference for an ideal body type is causing both fat and skinny people alike to suffer. She says that research by fat study scholars supports this, and the audience is supposed to take her word for it, which, as an academic of a local university, might not be too much to ask. The strategy, nevertheless, is a combination of exemplification and definition, the latter of which is meant to bring credibility to the discipline, which is likely required for the general audience. I mean, after all, have you heard of fat studies? I sure as hell didn't. Her comparison to other academics and disciplines clearly illustrates this point. She's trying to say, hey, look, this isn't a joke. This is a real discipline. Now, whether or not that's the case, I'm not really sure. I mean, I guess it's a real discipline. Obviously, she was published in this paper, but why is it in a women's studies department? Is it fat women's studies? Why don't they call it fat women's studies if that's the case? I just wonder why this thing exists whatsoever. But whatever. There's no shortage of people looking to find ways to be oppressed, especially in academia, and it sounds like Esther has found her place. The next paragraph is a combination of at least a couple strategies, namely authoritative quote and exemplification. In both cases, she wants to leave the audience with the impression that she's done her homework. And in fact, fat people face unfair treatment in important social settings. Now, how might this work to move her intended audience? Well, she's trying to show that she's informed on the topic. And citing these examples from her own experience, she said, hey, I've got data to support this position. And by the way, she's the one that created it. So for some who assume that these 3 examples suffice in making a much larger argument, she'll likely be doing well with those folks. It might show also goodwill on her part in pursuit to normalize and celebrate obesity, and this could bring a sense of calm and happiness to fat San Diegans all around. We could therefore argue that she's earning a good deal in the way of ethos for some people. The pathetic appeal is obvious too from these use of strategies. Going back to the strategy being used, exemplification, these stories seem to indicate potentially harsh and unfair treatment, and she wants the audience to feel pity and probably sadness or concern. And why might somebody feel this way? Because they don't want other people to be subjected to unfair treatment or undue cruelty. How about the appeal to logos? Well, in this case, she's making an argument by example, and that's called inductive reasoning. Providing examples in order to support her claim will be effective to the extent, in this case, that the audience believes that the instances here are truly unfair and constitute discrimination. Of course, it also requires them to believe that fat people should be treated with respect, but it's probably safe to say most people in the intended audience don't celebrate cruelty and that the majority of the population aren't psychopaths. On the other hand, this argument could very well fail. Ethos could take a hit, and she could find that much of her audience won't be moved by this argument. How? Consider these examples. Again, these are extreme experiences. They're likely outliers. And I wonder how many people that she surveyed or researched. Did she interview or poll thousands of people, tens of thousands of people? If so, she might actually be onto something. But are these examples representative of the entire group? If it's only a dozen, her argument is weak, but we don't know. But that could also be strategic on her end, withholding information. Maybe she doesn't want to reveal the sample size. But this leads to other questions. Did she embellish some of the research? Did the subjects that she interviewed embellish their accounts? Did they exaggerate these experiences? And by the way, this is their interpretation of the events. There's nothing less reliable than personal testimony. Nothing. That's why it is the weakest evidence you can bring in a court case. But going back to one of the specific examples, let's go to that guidance counselor. Perhaps this guidance counselor really concerned about this person. Maybe this person was overly concerned about college. Maybe their weight was so out of control that the guidance counselor suggested that she reconsider her priorities. Was this just an evil guidance counselor who took pleasure in the mental torture of youth? I'm not really sure, because we're not provided those sorts of contextual matters. We're given a very framed perspective. And so for these reasons, we could say the appeal to logos, by way of inductive reasoning, the examples, could be very well weak for some people. And for the same reasons, ethos might suffer. And what is the pathos appeal in this case? You could say these examples, because they're ineffective by way of reason, and because they're suspicious, is that going to invite trust? No. You could say that very likely it's going to instead foster a sense of skepticism, maybe annoyance or weariness. But we can't say that for the entire audience. We can only say that for a portion of the intended audience, this is likely the case. So what we just did is we looked at how, in using these strategies to advance her claims, she could have won some people over, and she could have at the same time lost some people as well. And still at this point, many others might be on the fence. But I think this next paragraph will scare all reasonable people away. In this paragraph, she writes that fat studies scholars have examined the economic interests masquerading as health concerns that fuel the weight loss industry. And she cites the big money being spent on weight loss programs and asks rhetorically, do these programs work in the long run? And she says no. So her claim is that these programs do not work. Also, there's another claim that she makes here, and that is, of course, that the industry is deceptive. But that's really not her entire point. That's just kind of an underhanded way of sliding them. So then we go here to the actual point. Weight loss programs don't work, and the reason for this She says, people are getting fatter and living longer. The life expectancy for Americans born in 1930 is 58 years and 62 years for women. Life expectancy for those born in 2004 is 75 and 80 respectively. This means that we're outliving our thinner grandparents by 20 years, exclamation mark. Of course, this is ridiculous. And this isn't merely my personal opinion. Most reasonable people will find an issue with this. The evidence that she provides, or the reason that she provides to support her conclusion, is not valid. Why? Because it takes, or it fails to take into consideration other variables, other factors that might have led to this increase in life expectancy. For example, in 1930, we were in the midst of a Great Depression. Not to mention, several decades later, there's been an enormous boon in medical advancements, and I actually just think that this is really silly altogether. But she should know better. She's actually a psychologist, and so she's well-versed in the area, or at least at one point was well-versed in the area of research, and to make a claim like this, based on this reason, is problematic in a number of ways. But for the intended audience, and that's where the focus must be, they'll likely see the same thing. They'll wonder how a professor at a local college ever got such a platform to make these kinds of claims. Even supporters of this, even people who want to go along with it, unless they're completely divorced from reality, have to admit this is nonsense. Accordingly, if the audience was already skeptical, they're going to be completely done at this point. Her ethos will suffer because she's not trustworthy. As we discussed just a moment ago, the appeal to logos is weak. The evidence does not support the conclusion. In turn, the appeal to pathos is not productive for her. People will not trust her. People will feel the opposite. They'll be weary. But the essay that you're writing has nothing to do with obesity or this article. Instead, I just wanted to illustrate how you can look at something and evaluate the merit of the argument in relation to the intended audience and weigh things like the strategy that's being used and how the intended audience could react favorably and not so favorably. All right, the last thing to go over is your introductory paragraph, and I'm just going to jump straight to the point. You should have 3 things. 1, a broad sentence that addresses the subject and gives relevance for your work. This can be a simple statement about the current state of events concerning the topic, or a note about the significance of the subject. Number 2, you should also map out the rhetorical situation and identify in broad terms the principal claims of the argument. One of the easiest ways to do this is using a modified rhetorical précis. I know a number of you are familiar with this form, having used it in earlier rhetoric classes. I've posted the template to Canvas, and I recommend that you use it for not only Reich, but the other authors as well. Number 3, you should use the rhetorical strategy meta-discourse to signal the structure or layout of your paper. What is meta-discourse? Well, look at the glossary of rhetorical strategies. That will explain it. But think of this as a roadmap. It's like directions to a destination you're giving to your reader. The destination obviously is the conclusion, and the route is however you've organized your paper to arrive at this point. So explain it to them so they don't get lost, and so you don't drift from your central point and begin rambling. Now, these 3 moves can be illustrated in a separate file posted on Canvas. If one were writing a rhetorical analysis on Rothblum, this might be the way, or this might be one way they would shape their introduction, and it runs parallel to the points that I just outlined here in this video. It's actually an old student sample from, it's been probably 10 years. Yeah, it's been more than 10 years. This is actually way back to my first class that I taught as a graduate assistant. Anyways, this introduction parallels the structure that we just went over. That is, starts broadly and contextualizes the argument that it's going to address, namely Rothblum, and then it signals, using meta-discourse, the layout or structure of the paper. Mind you, your task will be slightly more complicated because you'll be introducing the work of several authors as a point of comparison, but you'd only signal the fact that you're doing this in your introduction rather than introduce each specific piece in your introductory paragraph. That would take way too much time and space. But in addition to analyzing this work rhetorically in relation to the others, you're also offering a reflected perspective of your own. And so it will make matters slightly more complicated in that sense as well. One final piece of advice is to ensure that you account for how the authors shape the context and significance of Reich's argument. Remember, these folks are all having a conversation, and meaning can only be adequately captured in reference to everyone's voice. All right, that's it for this series. And as always, if you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.